A woman with burn scars covering half her face stood in the doorway of a Montana ranch house, snow whipping past her like ghosts. The man before her, desperate, proud, broken, had just asked her to marry him, not for love, for survival. In 30 days, he'd lose everything: his land, his son's future, the only thing left of the life he'd built with the wife he buried 6 months ago. And she was the only woman left in 50 miles. She should have said no. She'd survived worse men than Silas Kane. But the blizzard outside wasn't the only storm closing in, and sometimes the most dangerous choice is the one that offers hope. If you want to see how two strangers forced together by desperation become something neither of them expected, stay with me until the end. And drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The Montana Territory didn't forgive weakness. It took everything: crops, cattle, hope, and gave back only what you could wrest from frozen ground and bitter wind. Deadwood Creek was no different, a scatter of buildings huddled against the mountain's shadow, clinging to existence like frost to glass. Most who came didn't stay. Those who stayed learned to endure. Silas Kane had endured more than most. He stood at the edge of his property, boots sinking into February snow, staring at land that had cost him everything. 200 acres of grazing pasture, timber stands, a creek that ran clear even in drought. His father had died breaking this ground. His wife had died bringing life into it. Now it was all he had left, and in 30 days it would belong to someone else. The letter sat folded in his coat pocket, heavy as a stone. Legalese wrapped around a simple threat: fulfill the marriage clause or forfeit the deed. His father's will had been ironclad, written in an era when land meant legacy and legacy demanded heirs. A widower could hold the property, but only if he remarried within a year of his wife's death. Silas had 4 weeks. He turned back toward the house, a low structure of rough-cut pine and river stone, smoke threading from the chimney into the gray sky. Inside, his son would be at the table, probably still in his nightshirt, dark hair wild from sleep. Jeb was 7 now, old enough to notice his father's silences, young enough to still believe they could be fixed. Silas's jaw tightened. He'd lost Margaret in August. Pneumonia, swift and merciless, taking her in 3 days despite every prayer, every remedy. He'd buried her on a hillside overlooking the creek, beneath a pine she'd loved. For months after, he'd moved through the days like a man underwater, everything muffled and distant. The ranch had suffered. Fences sagged. The barn roof leaked. He'd let it all slide, unable to summon the will to care. Then the letter arrived. It should have come from a lawyer in Billings, formal and distant. Instead, it had been hand-delivered by Clayton Reese, a land speculator from back east who'd been circling Deadwood Creek like a vulture for 2 years. Reese wanted the timber rights, the water access. He wanted Silas gone, and he'd found the perfect weapon. Silas climbed the porch steps, shaking snow from his shoulders. The door creaked as he pushed it open, warmth rushing out to meet the cold. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and ash. A fire burned low in the hearth. Jeb sat at the table, spooning oatmeal with the mechanical focus of a child who'd rather be anywhere else. "Morning, Pa." "Morning, son." Silas crossed to the stove, poured coffee into a tin cup. His hands were steady. Years of ranching had taught him that much. But his mind churned. He needed a wife, not love, not companionship. Just a legal formality, a name on paper to satisfy a dead man's terms. But Deadwood Creek wasn't exactly flush with unmarried women. The nearest town, Greystone, was a 2-day ride south, and even there, prospects were slim. He'd thought about it obsessively, running through every possibility. There was Widow Calhoun, 60 if she was a day, half-deaf and ornery. She'd laugh him out of her parlor. There was the school teacher in Greystone, but she'd been courted by half the territory and had standards Silas couldn't meet. There were the saloon girls, but marrying one would bring its own complications: gossip, judgment, the kind of scrutiny Jeb didn't need, which left exactly one option: Alara Voss. Silas took a slow sip of coffee, feeling its heat settle in his chest. He hadn't wanted to consider it, hadn't wanted to even think about it, but the clock was ticking, and desperation had a way of clarifying things. Alara had been his housekeeper for 3 years. She'd arrived in Deadwood Creek on foot, carrying nothing but a worn canvas bag and a silence so deep It felt like armor. No one knew where she'd come from. No one asked. In a place like this, people understood that some stories were better left unspoken. She was in her late 20s, maybe 30, hard to tell. Burn scars covered the left side of her face and neck, puckered skin that spoke of old violence. Her left hand bore similar marks, the fingers slightly twisted. She kept her hair pulled back, wore drab colors, moved through the world like someone trying not to be seen. But she worked harder than any hired man Silas had ever known. She could split firewood, mend harness, cook a stew that would last 3 days. She never complained, never asked for more than her wages. When Margaret had fallen ill, Alara had nursed her without being asked, sitting up through the long nights, bathing her fevered skin, changing soiled linens. After Margaret died, she'd stayed on, cooking for Silas and Jeb, keeping the house from falling into chaos, asking nothing. He set the cup down, ran a hand through his hair. It was insane, a marriage of convenience to a woman he barely knew, a woman who'd made it clear through 3 years of careful distance that she wanted no part of anyone's life but her own. She'd refuse. Of course she would, and he couldn't blame her, but he had to ask. The door to the back room opened, and Alara emerged, carrying a basket of mending. She moved quietly, always had, footsteps barely audible on the plank floor. She glanced at Silas, then at Jeb, her expression unreadable. "More coffee?" she asked. Her voice was low, roughened by disuse. She spoke only when necessary, each word measured. "No, thank you." Silas hesitated. "Actually, I need to talk to you when you have a moment." Something flickered in her eyes. Caution, maybe suspicion. She nodded once, set the basket on a chair, and followed him to the far end of the room, near the window. Outside, snow was falling harder now, thick flakes blotting out the horizon. Silas turned to face her, searching for the right words. Up close, the scars were more pronounced, a landscape of old pain etched into skin. But her eyes were sharp, pale gray, like winter ice, and they missed nothing. "I'll get to the point," he said quietly. "I'm in a bind. My father's will has a clause. I have to remarry within a year of Margaret's death, or I lose the ranch. I've got 30 days left." Alara's expression didn't change, but her shoulders tightened fractionally. "I know this is," Silas exhaled. "I'm not asking for anything real, just a legal arrangement, a marriage on paper. You'd have security, a place here as long as you wanted it. I wouldn't expect anything. We'd live as we do now, separate, but it would keep the land in my name, keep Jeb's future intact." He stopped, waiting. Alara stared at him for a long moment, her face a mask. Then she shook her head, a single sharp motion. "No." The word was final, edged with something harder than refusal. "Alara, I said no." Her voice was still low, but there was steel beneath it. "I'm not interested in being anyone's convenience. Not again." She turned and walked back toward the kitchen, her spine rigid. Silas stood there, watching her go, the weight of failure settling over him like the snow outside. He'd expected it, but hearing it still felt like a door slamming shut. The rest of the day passed in tense silence. Alara worked with her usual efficiency, laundry, mending, bread rising by the fire. She didn't look at Silas, didn't speak beyond the bare minimum. Jeb, sensing the shift, kept his head down, playing quietly with a set of carved wooden horses his mother had given him. Silas retreated to the barn, throwing himself into chores. He mucked stalls, repaired a broken gate, checked the horses. Physical labor had always been his refuge, a way to silence the noise in his head. But today it didn't help. 30 days. If he lost the ranch, what then? Hired work in Greystone, maybe, if he could find it. A one-room shack for him and Jeb, scraping by on someone else's land. The thought made his gut twist. This place was more than property. It was his father's sweat, his wife's grave, his son's inheritance. It was the only thing he had left to give. By evening, the storm had worsened. Wind howled through the gaps in the barn walls, rattling loose boards. Silas finished feeding the horses and headed back to the house, shoulders hunched against the cold. Inside, the warmth was almost painful. Alara had dinner on the table, venison stew, cornbread, the last of the canned tomatoes. Jeb was already eating, shoveling food into his mouth with the single-minded determination of a growing boy. Silas sat down, nodded his thanks. Alara served him in silence, then took her own plate to the corner near the stove, where she always ate. Never at the table, never part of the family, even after 3 years. He watched her from the corner of his eye, trying to understand. She'd said not again. What did that mean? Had she been married before? Used? He knew nothing about her past, only that she carried it like a scar. Jeb finished eating and yawned, rubbing his eyes. "Bedtime," Silas said. The boy groaned but didn't argue. Alara rose, clearing the dishes with quick, practiced movements. Jeb climbed into the loft where his bed was tucked beneath the eaves, and Silas followed to tuck him in. "Pa?" "Yeah, son?" "Are we going to lose the ranch?" Silas's chest tightened. He smoothed the blanket, choosing his words carefully. "I'm working on it." "Miss Alara said no, didn't she?" Silas blinked. "You heard that?" Jeb shrugged, small shoulders lifting under the quilt. "I hear things." Of course he did. The house wasn't big enough for secrets. "She's got her reasons," Silas said quietly. "Can't fault her for that." Jeb frowned, thinking. Then he said, soft and serious, "Mama liked her." It was true. Margaret had trusted Alara in a way she'd trusted few people. She'd once told Silas, near the end, that Alara understood things most folks didn't. Pain, survival, the cost of enduring. Silas kissed his son's forehead. "Get some sleep." He climbed back down the ladder, found Alara at the wash basin, scrubbing dishes with methodical precision. The fire crackled. Outside, the storm raged. He stood there for a long moment, debating. Then he spoke. "I'm sorry for asking. I didn't mean to—" "It's not your fault." Her voice was flat, but not unkind. She didn't turn around. "You're desperate. I understand that." "I am." He rubbed the back of his neck. "But I shouldn't have put it on you." She set a plate on the drying rack, still facing away. "You think I don't know what people say about me? That I'm damaged, broken, that I should be grateful for scraps." "I don't think that." "Don't you?" Now she turned, and there was something raw in her eyes. "You need a wife. I'm the only option. That's not respect, Mr. Kane. That's convenience." The words stung because they were true. Silas met her gaze. "You're right, and I'm sorry." She studied him, searching for something. Honesty, maybe, or proof of deception. Then she turned back to the dishes. "You'll find another way," she said quietly. "You always do." But they both knew that wasn't true. 3 days passed. Silas rode into Greystone, hoping against hope for a miracle. He asked around, discreetly, testing the waters. The responses ranged from pity to mockery. Widow Calhoun cackled in his face. The schoolteacher politely declined before he even finished the question. The saloon girls were interested, but only if he paid off their debts first, an amount he didn't have. He returned to Deadwood Creek empty-handed and bone-tired. That night, he sat by the fire long after Jeb had gone to sleep, staring into the flames. The letter from Clayton Reese sat on the mantel, a constant reminder. Reese had visited twice since the first delivery, each time more insistent. The deadline was approaching. The land would go to auction, and Reese would be there, cash in hand, ready to swallow it whole. Silas heard footsteps behind him. Alara stood in the doorway to her room, wrapped in a shawl, her scarred face half-shadowed. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "No." She crossed to the fire, settled into the chair opposite him. For a while neither spoke. The wind rattled the shutters. Snow hissed against the windows. "I had a husband once," she said finally. Silas looked up, startled. Her eyes were on the flames. "Back in Kansas. I was 16. He was older, a blacksmith. My father sold me to him. Called it a marriage, but it was a transaction. I was property." She paused, her scarred hand resting on her knee. "He was cruel, not just with words. When I tried to leave, Her voice faltered, then steadied. "He held my hand over the forge, said I needed to learn my place." Silas's stomach turned. "I waited 2 years," she continued, "planned it careful. One night, while he was drunk, I took what I could carry and ran. Walked for weeks. Ended up here." She finally looked at him, and her eyes were hard. So when you asked me to marry you, even for convenience, all I heard was someone wanting to own me again, even if you didn't mean it that way. Silas felt the weight of her words settle over him like iron. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. I didn't know. How could you? She pulled the shawl tighter. I don't tell people. What's the point? It doesn't change anything. It changes how I see things. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I wasn't trying to own you, Alara. I was trying to survive. But I understand why you said no. And I won't ask again. She nodded slowly. Then, after a long silence, she said, What will you do? I don't know. He exhaled, shaking his head. Lose the ranch, I guess. Take Jeb somewhere else. Start over. Where? Wherever there's work. Alara looked back at the fire. The silence stretched. Then she said, so quietly he almost missed it, What if I said yes? Silas went still. What? What if I agreed? She didn't look at him. On my terms. Separate rooms, separate lives, just a name on paper, nothing else. His heart kicked against his ribs. Alara, I'm not doing it for you. Her voice was firm. I'm doing it because Jeb deserves better than losing his home, and because... She hesitated. Because maybe I'm tired of running. Silas stared at her, searching her face for certainty. You're sure? No. She finally met his eyes. But I'm saying yes anyway. He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Thank you. She shook her head. Don't thank me yet. This doesn't mean we're... anything. You understand that? I do. And if you ever... Her jaw tightened. If you ever try to make it more than what we agree to, I'll leave, and you won't find me. I won't, Silas said. You have my word. She studied him for a long moment, weighing his sincerity. Then she stood, pulling the shawl around her shoulders. We'll go into Greystone tomorrow. Get it done. And without another word, she disappeared into her room, leaving Silas alone by the fire, relieved, grateful, and more uncertain than he'd ever been. They rode into Greystone at dawn. The town was a scatter of buildings along a muddy main street flanked by the Bitterroot Range. A general store, a blacksmith, a two-room schoolhouse, a church with a crooked steeple. The justice of the peace operated out of a cramped office above the mercantile, a wizened man named Horace Greaves, who'd been marrying and burying folks for 30 years. Silas and Alara climbed the narrow stairs in silence. Jeb had stayed behind with a neighbor. This wasn't something he needed to witness. Greaves looked up from his desk, squinting over wire-rimmed spectacles. Silas Kane. Been a while. Mr. Greaves. Silas removed his hat. I need to file a marriage certificate. The old man's eyebrows lifted. He glanced at Alara, taking in the scars, the plain dress, the wary set of her shoulders. This the bride? Alara Voss, Silas said. We're here to make it legal. Greaves grunted, pulled a ledger from a shelf. You got witnesses? Just us. That'll do. He dipped a pen in ink, scrawled a few lines. You both of sound mind and free will? Yes, Silas said. Alara hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Greaves eyed her. You sure about this, miss? Man like Kane, he's got burdens. You know what you're taking on? I know, she said quietly. The old man shrugged. Your business, I suppose. He turned the ledger toward them. Sign here. Silas signed first, his handwriting firm and clear. Then he passed the pen to Alara. She stared at the page for a long moment, her scarred hand trembling slightly. Then she signed, Alara Voss Kane, and set the pen down. Greaves blotted the ink, stamped the document. By the authority vested in me by the Montana Territory, I pronounce you husband and wife. Congratulations. It was the most joyless wedding Silas had ever witnessed. They walked back down the stairs into the cold morning light. The street was empty, snow crunching under their boots. Alara pulled her coat tighter, staring straight ahead. It's done, she said. Yeah. We should go home. Home. The word felt strange, weighted with something neither of them could name. They climbed onto the wagon, and Silas took the reins. As they rolled out of Greystone, he glanced at her. You all right? I will be. He believed her. Alara Voss, no, Alara Kane now, had survived worse than this. She'd survive him too. But as they rode back toward Deadwood Creek, snow beginning to fall again, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that they'd both just stepped off a cliff. And neither of them knew if there was ground below. The news spread through Deadwood Creek like wildfire through dry grass. By the time Silas and Alara returned from Greystone, half the territory knew. The widower Kane had married his housekeeper, the scarred woman nobody talked to, the one who kept her head down and her past buried. Speculation ran wild at the general store, in the saloon, anywhere people gathered to pass judgment. Silas had expected it. Small towns fed on gossip like wolves on carrion. What he hadn't expected was the hostility. The first sign came 3 days after the wedding. Silas was in the barn, repairing harness leather, when he heard horses approaching. He stepped outside, squinting against the afternoon glare, and saw 3 riders coming up the road. Clayton Reese led them. Reese was a tall man, lean and sharp-featured, dressed too well for Montana. His coat was Eastern cut, his boots polished despite the mud. He sat his horse like a man who'd learned to ride late in life, competent but uncomfortable. The 2 men flanking him were different. Ranch hands, maybe, or hired muscle, hard-eyed and silent. Silas wiped his hands on his pants and stepped forward. "Mr. Reese?" "Kane." Reese dismounted with deliberate slowness, brushing dust from his sleeves. "Heard you got married. Congratulations." There was no warmth in the word. "Appreciate it," Silas said evenly. Reese smiled, thin and cold. "Must have been quite the whirlwind romance. What's it been? 3 days since I delivered that letter? You work fast." "I do what needs doing." Reese walked closer, his gaze sweeping the property. "Interesting choice of bride, though. Your housekeeper. Some might call that convenient." Silas's jaw tightened. "Some might. I call it my business." Of course, of course." Reese clasped his hands behind his back, the picture of false civility. "I'm just here to make sure everything's above board. The will specifies a legitimate marriage, after all, not just a piece of paper." "It's legitimate." "Is it?" Reese tilted his head. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a desperate man gaming the system. And if that's the case..." He let the threat hang. Silas took a step forward, his voice dropping. "You questioning the legality of my marriage, Reese?" "I'm questioning your intent." Reese's smile widened. "But I suppose that's for a judge to decide, if it comes to that." The 2 hired men shifted in their saddles, hands resting near their belts. Silas held his ground. "You got something to say. Say it plain." Reese studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. "Just wanted to check in. Make sure you understand the land's not secure until I say it is. And if I find any reason to challenge this arrangement..." He gestured vaguely toward the house. "Well, we'll see." He turned and mounted his horse with theatrical precision, gathering the reins. "Give my regards to your bride," he said, and spurred his horse back down the road, his men following. Silas stood there watching them go, fury simmering in his chest. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He turned back toward the house and found Alara standing in the doorway, arms crossed, her face unreadable. "Trouble?" she asked. "Always is. With him?" She nodded slowly, then stepped back inside without another word. Silas followed, closing the door behind him. The house was warm, the fire crackling, but the tension from the encounter lingered like smoke. Jeb was at the table, working on his letters, crooked lines scratched onto a slate. He looked up, sensing the shift in mood. "Who was that, Pa?" "Nobody important." Alara moved to the stove, stirring a pot of stew with mechanical focus. Silas watched her, trying to read her thoughts. She'd agreed to this arrangement, but she hadn't signed up for confrontation, for threats. "Alara, I heard," she said quietly, not turning around. "He thinks this is fake. It doesn't matter what he thinks." "Doesn't it?" She set the spoon down, finally looking at him. "If he challenges the marriage, they'll investigate, ask questions, and I'm not exactly..." She gestured to her face. "The picture of a legitimate bride. That's not... It's how people see me, Silas." Her voice was flat, resigned. "I know what I am, what I look like. If they want to tear this apart, they will." Silas crossed the room, stopping a few feet from her. "Then we don't give them a reason." She met his gaze, skeptical. How? We act like it's real. In public, show them we're a family. Alara's expression hardened. I agreed to a legal arrangement, not a performance. I know, but if we don't make it convincing, Reese will find a way to take everything. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I'm not asking you to be something you're not. Just don't hide. Let people see us together. See that this isn't some scheme. She was silent for a long moment, her scarred hand gripping the edge of the stove. And if I can't? She asked quietly. Then we figure it out. Together. The word hung between them. Together. It felt both fragile and impossibly heavy. Alara turned back to the stew, her shoulders rigid. I'll think about it. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. That night Silas lay awake in his room, staring at the ceiling. Through the thin wall, he could hear Alara moving, restless, like him. The house creaked in the wind, settling into the cold. He'd promised her separate lives, separate rooms. But the world outside didn't care about their arrangement. It would judge them, scrutinize them, look for cracks. And if they failed, Jeb would lose everything. The next morning, Silas woke to the sound of splitting wood. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside, breath fogging in the dawn air. Alara was at the chopping block, swinging the axe with practiced precision. Logs split cleanly, falling to either side. She worked without pause, her movements efficient and strong. Silas watched for a moment, impressed despite himself. She was tougher than most men he knew. Need help? He called. She glanced up, wiping sweat from her brow despite the cold. I've got it. I can see that. She set another log on the block, raised the axe. If you're going to stand there, make yourself useful. Stack the wood. He grinned slightly, grabbed an armful of split logs, and started stacking them against the side of the house. They worked in silence, the rhythm settling between them. Her chopping, him stacking. It felt oddly natural, like something they'd done 100 times before. When the pile was finished, Alara leaned the axe against the block and rolled her shoulders. You're good at that, Silas said. Had to be. She flexed her scarred hand. My husband didn't believe women should sit idle. There was no bitterness in her voice, just fact. But Silas felt the weight of it anyway. He was a fool, he said. Alara looked at him sharply, surprised. Then something softened in her expression, just for a moment. Maybe. She walked past him toward the house, and Silas followed. Inside, Jeb was awake, dressed and waiting for breakfast. Alara moved to the stove, dishing out oatmeal with quick, practiced motions. As they ate, Jeb asked, Are you and Miss Alara really married now, Pa? Silas glanced at Alara, who kept her eyes on her bowl. We are, he said carefully. Does that mean she's my ma? The question hit like a stone. Alara's spoon stilled mid-bite. She didn't look up. Silas cleared his throat. Miss Alara is part of our family now, but she's not trying to replace your ma. Nobody could. Jeb frowned, thinking. But Mama's gone, and Miss Alara's here. That's true. So can I call her Ma Alara? Alara finally looked up, her gray eyes wide with something unreadable. Shock, maybe, or fear. You don't have to call me anything, she said quietly. Miss Alara is fine. Jeb considered this. What if I want to? She stared at him, and for a moment Silas saw something crack in her carefully maintained walls, a flicker of vulnerability, quickly buried. Then, I suppose that's all right, she said softly. Jeb grinned, satisfied, and went back to his oatmeal. Silas caught Alara's eye across the table. She looked shaken, like the ground had shifted beneath her. But she didn't argue, and that, he thought, was something. The following week brought the first real test. A supply run to Greystone was overdue, and Silas needed to restock essentials: flour, salt, ammunition. Normally he'd go alone, but with Reese circling and gossip spreading, he decided to bring Alara. Let people see them together. Let them witness that this wasn't just paperwork. Alara resisted at first. I don't need to go, she said, shaking her head. You can handle it. I can, Silas agreed. But it'd be better if you came. Show people we're a unit. I'm not an ornament to parade around. I'm not asking you to be. He kept his voice steady. I'm asking you to stand beside me, just this once. If it's too much, we won't do it again. She stared at him, jaw tight. Then, reluctantly, she nodded. They left Jeb with the neighbor again, a widow named Mrs. Crenshaw, who doted on the boy, and rode into town together. The wagon creaked over frozen ruts, the horse's breath fogging in the cold. Alara sat stiffly beside him, hands folded in her lap, her scarred face partially hidden by the brim of her hat. Silas could feel her tension radiating like heat. "You all right?" he asked. "No." "Fair enough." She glanced at him. "You really think this'll help?" "I think it's worth trying. And if people stare, if they whisper, then they stare and whisper," Silas said evenly. "Doesn't change who we are." Alara looked away, her expression unreadable. Greystone was busy when they arrived. Market day brought folks in from surrounding ranches. The main street bustled with wagons, horses, people moving between the mercantile and the feed store. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop outside the general store and set the brake. "Stay close," he said quietly. Alara nodded, climbing down with rigid grace. The moment they stepped inside the store, conversations faltered, eyes turned. Whispers rippled through the crowded aisles. Silas ignored it, heading for the counter. "Afternoon, Mr. Halford." The storekeeper, a portly man with graying whiskers, looked up from his ledger. His gaze flicked to Alara, then back to Silas. "Kane, heard you got hitched." "That I did." Silas rested a hand on the counter. "Need to stock up. Flour, salt, coffee, ammunition, the usual." Halford nodded slowly, his expression carefully neutral. "Sure thing." As he moved to gather supplies, Silas felt Alara shift beside him. She was holding herself so still she might as well have been carved from stone. A woman approached, Mrs. Pritchard, the banker's wife, dressed in an elaborate traveling coat. She'd always been polite to Silas, in that distant way wealthy townspeople were to ranchers. Now her smile was thin and brittle. "Mr. Kane," she said sweetly, "how unexpected. I didn't realize you were courting." "Wasn't much courting involved," Silas said evenly. "We married quiet. Didn't see the point in a fuss." Mrs. Pritchard's gaze slid to Alara, lingering on the scars. "And this is my wife, Alara Kane." The words felt strange on his tongue, but he said them with conviction. Mrs. Pritchard's smile tightened. "How lovely. I'm sure you'll be very happy." There was a wealth of judgment in that pause. Alara said nothing, her face a mask, but Silas saw the way her scarred hand clenched at her side. Mrs. Pritchard drifted away, and Halford returned with the supplies. They loaded everything into the wagon in silence, Silas paying with the last of his cash reserves. As they climbed back onto the wagon, a voice called out, "Kane!" Silas turned. A man was striding toward them, Garrett Moss, a rancher from the next valley over, big, loud, perpetually drunk. He stopped beside the wagon, grinning up at them. "Heard you married the help," Moss said, slurring slightly. "That true?" Silas's jaw tightened. "She's my wife, Moss. Watch your mouth." Moss laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your wife? Right. You must have been real desperate, Kane. Marrying a—" "Finish that sentence," Silas said quietly, "and you'll regret it." Moss's grin faltered. He glanced at Alara, sneering. "She even talk? Or is she just for—" Silas was off the wagon before Moss could finish. He grabbed the man by his coat, shoving him back hard enough that Moss stumbled, landing on his backside in the mud. "Get up," Silas said, voice low and dangerous. "Say it again." Moss scrambled to his feet, red-faced and sputtering. "You're crazy, Kane. Say it." Moss looked around, realizing people were watching. He spat into the dirt, then turned and staggered away, muttering curses. Silas stood there, fists clenched, breathing hard. When he finally turned back to the wagon, Alara was staring at him, her expression unreadable, but something flickered in her eyes. "Let's go," he said quietly. They rode out of town in silence. The road stretched ahead, empty and white with snow. Silas's hands were tight on the reins, his anger still simmering. "You didn't have to do that," Alara said finally. "Yes, I did." "Why?" He glanced at her. "Because you're my wife, and nobody talks about you like that." She looked away, jaw working. "It's just words, Silas. I've heard worse." "Maybe." But you shouldn't have to. They rode another mile before she spoke again, her voice softer. Thank you. It was barely a whisper, but Silas heard it. He nodded. Anytime. When they got back to the ranch, Jeb came running out to meet them, full of energy and questions. Alar climbed down from the wagon and knelt to his level, listening as he chattered about his day with Mrs. Crenshaw. Silas watched them, something tightening in his chest. She was careful with Jeb, patient, attentive. She treated him like he mattered. Over the next 2 weeks, a fragile routine began to form. Alara stopped eating apart from them, taking her place at the table. She didn't say much, but her presence became part of the rhythm of their days. She worked alongside Silas, mending fences, hauling feed, caring for the livestock. She was strong, capable, tireless, and slowly, carefully, the walls between them began to shift. One evening, after Jeb had gone to bed, Silas found Alara outside, standing near the fence line, staring out at the dark expanse of land. Cold out here, he said, joining her. I like it. She pulled her coat tighter. Quiet. They stood in silence for a moment, breath fogging in the frigid air. You settling in all right? Silas asked. As much as I can. That mean you're staying? She glanced at him. Where else would I go? Anywhere. You're not trapped here. Aren't I? Her voice was soft, almost resigned. This is the deal, Silas. I signed the paper. I'm tied to this place now, whether I like it or not. Doesn't have to feel like a trap. Maybe. She looked back at the horizon. I spent years running. Thought if I kept moving, I'd find somewhere safe. But safe doesn't exist. Not really. Maybe not, Silas said quietly. But maybe here's close enough. Alara didn't respond. But she didn't leave either. The threat returned on a frozen morning in early March. Silas was in the barn when he heard shouting. He grabbed his rifle and ran outside, finding Alara and Jeb near the house, both staring toward the ridge. A lone rider was approaching, fast. Silas raised the rifle, then lowered it as he recognized the horse. It was Ben Harker, a young rancher from downriver, riding like the devil was behind him. Harker reined up hard, his horse lathered and blowing. Kane, you gotta get out. Slow down, Silas said. What's going on? Reese. Harker was panting, wild-eyed. He's coming. Brought a dozen men. Says he's got proof your marriage is a sham. Says he's taking the land today. Silas's blood turned to ice. How long? Hour, maybe less. Alara stepped forward, her face pale. What kind of proof? Don't know. But he's got the sheriff with him. And a judge. Silas cursed under his breath, mind racing. If Reese had legal backing, this wasn't just intimidation, it was an eviction. Jeb, he said sharply, inside, now. The boy obeyed without question, running for the house. Silas turned to Alara. You should go with him. This could get ugly. No. Alara, no. Her voice was steel. This is my home too. I'm not hiding. He stared at her, seeing the fear in her eyes. But something else, too. Determination. Resolve. All right, he said quietly. We stand together. Harker looked between them. You need help? Spread the word. Anyone who will listen. But don't get yourself hurt. Harker nodded and spurred his horse back down the road. Silas and Alara stood in the yard, waiting. Within the hour, riders appeared on the horizon, a dozen men, just as Harker had said. Reese led them, flanked by Sheriff Donovan and a man in a black coat, the judge, Silas assumed. They rode into the yard with deliberate arrogance, surrounding the house. Reese dismounted, smiling. Kane, Mrs. Kane, so good to see you. Silas stepped forward, rifle in hand but lowered. State your business, Reese. Gladly, Reese gestured to the judge. Judge Fenton has reviewed your marriage certificate, and we've gathered testimony suggesting this union is fraudulent, a legal maneuver to circumvent your father's will. That's a lie, Silas said flatly. Is it? Reese pulled a folded paper from his coat. I have statements from townspeople. Mrs. Pritchard, Mr. Halford, even Garrett Moss, all testifying that your marriage is one of convenience, not genuine affection. Alara's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Judge Fenton, a gaunt man with cold eyes, stepped forward. The law requires proof of a legitimate union, cohabitation, shared interests, evidence of mutual commitment. Can you provide such proof? Silas opened his mouth, but Alara spoke first. We're married, she said, her voice steady. Legally. What more proof do you need? Intent, Fenton said coldly. A marriage of convenience can be annulled if proven fraudulent. Then prove it, she challenged. Reese smiled. I already have. He gestured to his men. Two of them dismounted, moving toward the house. Silas raised the rifle. Take another step, and we'll have a problem. Sheriff Donovan stepped forward, hand on his pistol. Put the gun down, Kane. Don't make this worse. Worse? Silas's voice was low, dangerous. You're trying to steal my land based on gossip. We're enforcing the law, Fenton said. Either prove your marriage is legitimate or vacate the premises. Alara stepped beside Silas, standing so close their shoulders almost touched. This is our home, she said quietly. We're not leaving. Reese's smile widened. Then I'm afraid you leave me no choice. He nodded to his men. And just as they moved forward, a new sound cut through the tension. Hooves, dozens of them, thundering up the road. Everyone turned. A group of riders crested the hill, ranchers, townspeople, men and women Silas recognized from Deadwood Creek and beyond. At the front was Ben Harker, and beside him, Mrs. Crenshaw. Behind them, others, families who'd known Silas for years. They formed a line between Reese's men and the house. Harker dismounted, facing Reese. You got a problem here, Reese. Reese's smile faltered. This is legal business. Looks like bullying to me. Mrs. Crenshaw stepped forward, arms crossed. Kane's a good man, and his wife, too. You got no right. Judge Fenton bristled. The law is supposed to be fair, Harker interrupted, not twisted to suit rich men. A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered crowd. Reese looked around, realizing he'd lost control. His men shifted uneasily, outnumbered and uncertain. Sheriff Donovan cleared his throat. Maybe we should reconsider, do this proper, through the courts. Fenton glared at him, but the sheriff didn't back down. After a long, tense moment, Reese exhaled sharply. Fine. We'll settle this in Billings, legally. He turned to Silas, his expression venomous. But this isn't over, Kane. Not by a long shot. He mounted his horse, and his men followed. The judge climbed onto his wagon, and they rode off, leaving dust and anger in their wake. The crowd lingered, offering quiet words of support before dispersing. Harker clapped Silas on the shoulder. You all right? Yeah, thanks, Ben. Any time. As the last rider disappeared down the road, Silas lowered the rifle, feeling the adrenaline drain from his body. Alara stood beside him, trembling slightly but still upright. You okay? He asked. I think so. Jeb came running out of the house, throwing his arms around Alara's waist. She stiffened, then slowly, carefully, rested a hand on his head. Silas watched them, something shifting inside him, something he didn't have a name for yet. Come on, he said quietly. Let's go inside. That night, after Jeb was asleep, Silas found Alara by the fire again. She looked exhausted, her shoulders sagging. Thank you, he said, for standing with me. I didn't have a choice. You did. You could have run. She looked at him, and for the first time he saw something close to trust in her eyes. Maybe I'm tired of running, she said softly. Silas nodded. Then we'll face whatever comes, together. She didn't respond, but she didn't look away either, and in that moment something unspoken passed between them. A fragile thread of connection, woven from shared fear and unexpected courage. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something stronger. The threat of legal action hung over the ranch like storm clouds that refused to break. Days turned into a week, then two, and still no word came from Billings. Reese had retreated, but Silas knew better than to mistake silence for surrender. Men like Clayton Reese didn't give up. They regrouped, planned, waited for the perfect moment to strike. In the meantime, life on the ranch continued with a new intensity. Silas worked longer hours, fixing everything that had fallen into disrepair during his months of grief. Alara matched him stroke for stroke, never complaining, never asking for rest. They moved around each other with increasing ease, their initial awkwardness giving way to something that felt almost like partnership. Jeb was the bridge between them, chattering at dinner about his day, asking Alara to help with his letters, begging Silas to teach him to ride better. The boy seemed lighter somehow, as if the presence of two adults working in tandem had given him permission to be a child again. One morning in late March, Silas was mending the pasture fence when he heard Jeb's voice, high and excited, calling from near the creek. He dropped his tools and ran, heart pounding, expecting injury or worse. What he found instead stopped him cold. Jeb stood at the creek's edge, pointing downstream. Alara was in the water up to her knees, her skirt soaked and heavy, her arms wrapped around something large and struggling. As Silas got closer, he realized it was a calf, newborn by the look of it, wet and shivering, its mother nowhere in sight. "She found it caught in the current," Jeb shouted. Ma Alara went right in. Silas waded into the icy water without thinking, reaching Alara just as she stumbled on the slick rocks. He grabbed the calf from her arms, its weight solid and warm despite the freezing water, and carried it to shore. Alara followed, her teeth chattering, her scarred hand gripping his arm for balance. On the bank, she collapsed to her knees, gasping. Her lips were blue, her whole body shaking. "Get her inside," Silas told Jeb. "Quick, start the fire high." Jeb ran. Silas wrapped his coat around Alara's shoulders and half carried her toward the house, the calf bawling behind them. She tried to protest, to say she was fine, but her words came out jumbled and weak. Inside, the fire was already roaring. Jeb had piled on wood with reckless abandon, and the room was warming fast. Silas guided Alara to the chair nearest the hearth, then grabbed blankets from her room, wrapping them around her trembling form. "You could have drowned," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "The calf could have been replaced. You can't." Alara looked up at him, water dripping from her hair, her gray eyes wide with something like surprise. "You don't mean that." "I do." He knelt beside the chair, meeting her gaze. "Don't do that again. Not for livestock, not for anything." She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face. Then she nodded, so faintly he almost missed it. Jeb appeared with hot coffee, sloshing it in his hurry. Alara took the cup with shaking hands, sipping carefully. Color slowly returned to her cheeks. Outside, the calf had stopped bawling. Silas went to check on it, finding the small creature curled in the grass, exhausted but alive. He carried it to the barn, settling it in a stall with fresh hay and a blanket. When he returned to the house, Alara was on her feet again, insisting she was fine, already moving toward the stove to start dinner. "Sit down," Silas said firmly. I know you can, but you don't have to. Not today." She hesitated, then sank back into the chair, pulling the blankets tighter. Silas took over at the stove, feeling her eyes on him as he worked. It was strange, this reversal, him cooking while she rested, but it felt right somehow. That night, after Jeb had gone to bed, Alara spoke from her place by the fire. "Why did you say that, about me not being replaceable?" Silas looked up from the harness he was oiling. "Because it's true." You're not just anything," he interrupted. "You work harder than any hand I've ever hired. You care for Jeb like he's your own, and you stood beside me when Reese came with his threats. That's not nothing, Alara." She looked down at her scarred hands, firelight playing across the damaged skin. "I never thought anyone would say something like that to me." "Then people have been fools." A small, unexpected smile touched her lips, the first real smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, softening the hard edges, making her look younger. Silas felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The next day brought visitors. Mrs. Crenshaw arrived mid-morning with a basket of fresh bread and preserves, ostensibly to check on Jeb, but really to satisfy her curiosity about how Silas and Alara were managing. She was a kind woman, pragmatic and sharp-eyed, and she'd been one of the few people in Deadwood Creek who'd never treated Alara with open disdain. "Heard about the calf," she said, settling herself at the table while Alara poured coffee. "Brave thing you did." Alara shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "It needed help. Most folks would have let it go. Too much trouble." Mrs. Crenshaw studied her over the rim of her cup. "You settling in all right here, being married and all?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. "Well enough," Alara said carefully. "Silas treating you right?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Crenshaw nodded, satisfied. Good. Man's been through hell losing Margaret, but he's decent, doesn't have a cruel bone in him. She paused. Unlike some. Alara met her eyes, understanding the unspoken reference. Mrs. Crenshaw knew. Maybe not the details, but enough to recognize the shape of old wounds. He's been fair, Alara said quietly. Fair's a start. But you deserve more than fair, girl. The words settled into Alara like seeds in soil. Uncomfortable, unexpected, but somehow right. After Mrs. Crenshaw left, Alara found herself thinking about what the older woman had said. She'd spent so long expecting the bare minimum, accepting scraps and calling them sustenance, that the idea of deserving more felt almost dangerous. But here, on this ranch, with Silas and Jeb, it was different. They didn't treat her like damaged goods. They treated her like she mattered. The realization was terrifying. A week later, the storm everyone had been dreading finally broke. But not in the way anyone expected. It started with smoke on the northern horizon, visible from the ridge behind the house. Silas saw it first, a dark smudge against the pale afternoon sky. His gut clenched. Fire! He ran for the barn, saddled his horse in record time, and rode hard toward the smoke. As he crested the ridge, his worst fears materialized. The northern pasture was burning, flames racing through the dry winter grass, driven by a stiff wind toward the tree line. And beyond the trees, the ranch. Silas spurred his horse back, shouting as he went. By the time he reached the yard, Alara was already outside, staring at the approaching smoke, her face set and grim. "Get Jeb to the Crenshaws," Silas barked, dismounting. "Now!" "No!" She was already moving toward the barn. "We fight it together." Alara, there's no time to argue. She was right. The fire was moving fast, too fast. If they didn't act immediately, everything would be ash by nightfall. They worked with desperate efficiency. Silas grabbed shovels and blankets from the barn, while Alara pumped water into every bucket they owned. Jeb, wide-eyed but brave, helped carry supplies to the wagon. They loaded everything and drove toward the fire line, the smoke thickening with every yard. The heat hit them first, a wall of scorching air that made breathing difficult. Then they saw the flames, a ragged line of orange and red consuming everything in their path. The roar was deafening, punctuated by the crack of burning timber. Silas jumped from the wagon, shouting instructions. They soaked blankets in the creek and began beating at the flames, trying to create a fire break. The heat was unbearable, the smoke choking. Alara worked beside him, relentless and fearless, her face streaked with soot and ash. Jeb stayed with the wagon, refilling buckets, his small hands working as fast as they could. But the fire kept coming. Silas's arms burned with exhaustion, his lungs raw from smoke. Beside him, Alara stumbled, caught herself, kept going. They were losing ground, the flames spreading faster than they could contain them. Then, through the smoke, figures appeared. Ben Harker came first, riding hard with 3 other ranchers behind him. They'd seen the smoke from miles away and come running. More followed. Mrs. Crenshaw with her sons, families from Deadwood Creek and beyond, all carrying shovels and buckets and grim determination. The fight became a coordinated effort. They formed a line, beating back the flames, digging trenches to starve the fire of fuel. Alara moved among them like a general, shouting directions, organizing teams, never slowing. People who'd whispered about her days ago now followed her commands without question. Hours passed in a blur of heat and smoke and aching muscles. The sun sank toward the horizon, painting the sky the same color as the flames. And slowly, inch by brutal inch, they gained ground. By the time full darkness fell, the fire was contained. Exhausted firefighters collapsed where they stood, coughing and gasping. The northern pasture was scorched black, still smoldering in places, but the tree line had held. The ranch was safe. Silas stood at the edge of the burned ground, swaying with exhaustion, and felt Alara's hand on his arm, steadying him, grounding him. "It's over," she said, her voice hoarse. "Yeah." They stood together in the ash-streaked darkness, surrounded by people who'd risked everything to save a neighbor's land. Someone passed around canteens of water. Someone else started a song, low and tired but defiant. Mrs. Crenshaw appeared beside them, her face smudged and weary. "Hell of a fight." Silas nodded, too tired for words. The older woman looked at Alara, respect clear in her eyes. You did good, girl. Real good. Alara's throat worked, but she said nothing. As the crowd began to disperse, heading home in ones and twos, Silas finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind since the fire started. How did it begin? Ben Harker, lingering nearby, spoke up. Found tracks. Boot prints near where the fire started. Weren't no lightning strike, Kane. Somebody said it. Silas's blood turned cold. Reese. Can't prove it, but yeah, probably. Alara's hand tightened on Silas's arm, her face hardening. He tried to burn us out. And he'll try again, Silas said quietly. This isn't over. But looking at the faces around him, neighbors who'd fought beside them, people who'd seen Alara's courage and strength, he felt something shift. They weren't alone anymore. The town had witnessed what she was capable of. They'd seen her lead, seen her fight, seen her refuse to break, and they'd followed her. The next morning, Silas rode into Greystone with a specific purpose. He went straight to Sheriff Donovan's office, his jaw set and his mind made up. Donovan looked up from his desk, resignation already settling over his features. Kane, someone set fire to my land last night, deliberately. The sheriff sighed. You got proof? Boot prints, timing, motive. Silas leaned over the desk. Reese has been trying to take my ranch for months. Now he's escalating. You got witnesses who saw him light the match? No. Then there's nothing I can do. Silas's hands clenched into fists. So he just gets away with it? Unless you can prove it was him, yes. Donovan stood, meeting Silas's glare. Look, I know you're angry, but the law needs evidence, not suspicion. The law. Silas laughed bitterly. The law's been on Reese's side from the start. That's not... Save it. Silas turned and walked out, fury simmering in his veins. He was halfway back to the ranch when he saw the rider approaching. Not Reese this time, but a younger man, well-dressed, carrying a leather satchel. He reined up as Silas approached. Mr. Kane? Depends who's asking. My name is Thomas Ashford. I'm a lawyer from Billings. He pulled a document from his satchel. I represent Clayton Reese in the matter of your contested marriage. Silas's jaw tightened. Speak your piece. Ashford unfolded the document, his expression professionally neutral. Mr. Reese is prepared to drop all legal challenges to your marriage and pay you $5,000 for your property. It's a generous offer, Mr. Kane, more than the land's worth. My land's not for sale. With respect, you may not have a choice. The hearing is set for 2 weeks from now. If the judge rules against you, then I'll deal with it. Mr. Kane, tell Reese, Silas said, his voice low and dangerous, that he can take his offer and his threats and ride straight to hell. I'm not leaving, and neither is my wife. Ashford's professional mask slipped slightly. You're making a mistake. Maybe, but it's mine to make. The lawyer tucked the document away, shaking his head. I'll convey your response. He rode off, leaving Silas alone on the empty road. When Silas got home, he found Alara in the barn, tending to the calf she'd saved from the creek. The small creature had thrived under her care, growing stronger each day. She looked up as he entered, reading his expression. What happened? He told her about Ashford, about Reese's offer. Her face darkened. He's trying to buy us out. Won't work. The hearing's in 2 weeks. I know. Silas leaned against the stall door. We need to be ready. If Reese has his lawyer building a case, we need to do the same. Alara stood, brushing hay from her skirt. What kind of case? Proof that our marriage is real. Witnesses. Evidence that we're a family. She looked at him, something unreadable in her eyes. Are we? The question hung between them, heavy with meaning. Silas chose his words carefully. I think we're becoming one, aren't we? Alara's gaze dropped to the calf, then back to him. I don't know what a real family looks like, Silas. Mine sold me. His... She touched her scarred face. I've never had people who stayed. We're staying, Silas said firmly. Jeb and me. We're not going anywhere. You say that now? I mean it. He stepped closer, close enough to see the doubt warring with hope in her eyes. You saved that calf because it needed you. You fought that fire because you weren't going to let everything burn. You stood beside me when Reese came with his threats. He paused. That's family, Alara. People who show up, people who stay. Her breath caught, and for a moment he thought she might cry, but she didn't. Instead, she nodded slowly, something hardening into resolve. Then we fight, she said. For real this time. Yeah, we do. That evening they sat at the table after Jeb had gone to bed, planning their strategy. They needed witnesses who could testify to the legitimacy of their marriage, people who'd seen them together, working as partners, building a life. Mrs. Crenshaw was the obvious choice. Ben Harker, too. Maybe some of the others who'd fought the fire. People who'd seen Alara not as the scarred housekeeper, but as someone integral to the ranch's survival. But as they talked, Silas realized something. The best evidence wasn't testimony from others. It was the truth sitting right in front of them. We need to tell our story, he said. Exactly how it happened, why we married, what it became. Alara frowned. You mean tell them it started as an arrangement? Yeah, because it did. And then it became something real. He met her eyes. That's not fraud, Alara. That's life. People marry for all kinds of reasons. What matters is what they build after. She considered this, turning it over in her mind. You think the judge will see it that way? I think if we're honest, completely honest, we've got a chance. Alara's scarred hand rested on the table, and before he could think about it, Silas covered it with his own. She stiffened but didn't pull away. We can do this, he said quietly. Together. She looked at their joined hands, then at him, and slowly, carefully, she turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his. Together, she repeated. It was the first time they'd touched like this. Deliberately, not out of necessity or accident. The moment stretched, fragile and charged, both of them acutely aware of the shift happening between them. Then Alara pulled her hand back, not harshly, but with clear intent, and stood. I should sleep. Long day tomorrow. Yeah. She disappeared into her room, leaving Silas alone with the echo of her touch still warming his palm. The days leading up to the hearing passed in a blur of preparation. They gathered statements from neighbors, documented the work Alara had done on the ranch, compiled evidence of their shared life. Silas even rode to Billings to hire a lawyer of his own, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Brennan, who'd made her name defending homesteaders against land speculators. Brennan listened to their story without judgment, making notes in a careful hand. Your honesty might actually work in your favor, she said when they finished. Reese wants to paint this as fraud, but fraud requires deception. You're not hiding anything. You married to save the land, and over time you built a real partnership. That's legally sound. And if the judge doesn't see it that way? Silas asked. Brennan's expression hardened. Then we appeal. And we keep fighting until we win. The night before the hearing, neither Silas nor Alara could sleep. They found themselves at the kitchen table again, the fire burning low, the house creaking in the wind. Are you scared? Alara asked. Terrified, Silas admitted. Me too. They sat in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Alara spoke again. If we lose, if they take the ranch, what will you do? Find work. Take care of Jeb. Start over somewhere else. And me? Silas looked at her, surprised. You'd come with us. Would I? Of course. He frowned. Unless you didn't want to. Alara's eyes were shadowed, unreadable. I don't know what I want, Silas. I thought I did. I thought I wanted to be left alone, to be invisible. But now? Now I don't know if I can go back to that. The vulnerability in her voice cracked something open in Silas's chest. He reached across the table, not touching her but offering his hand, palm up. After a long moment, she placed her scarred hand in his. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said, we face it together. And whatever comes after, we figure it out. Together. Alara's eyes glistened, firelight reflecting in unshed tears. You keep saying that word. Because I mean it. She squeezed his hand once, then let go, standing. We should rest. Big day. Alara? She paused at the doorway to her room, looking back. Thank you, Silas said, for not giving up. On this place. On us. A small, sad smile touched her lips. I'm still here, aren't I? Yeah, you are. She disappeared into her room, and Silas sat alone in the fading firelight, feeling the weight of tomorrow pressing down on him. They'd fought fire. They'd faced down threats. They'd built something fragile and unexpected out of desperation and necessity. Now they had to prove it was real. And Silas had never been more certain of anything, or more afraid of losing it. The courtroom in Billings was smaller than Silas had imagined, a cramped space with wooden benches worn smooth by decades of nervous hands. Morning light slanted through high windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted like ash. The room smelled of old paper and floor wax, and the air felt heavy with the weight of other people's judgments. Silas sat beside Alara at the defendant's table, Catherine Brennan on his other side, shuffling through documents with practiced efficiency. Across the aisle, Clayton Reese sat with Thomas Ashford, both men wearing expressions of calm confidence. Behind them, the gallery was packed. Townspeople from Deadwood Creek and Greystone, curiosity seekers, and those who'd come to witness what they assumed would be Silas Kane's public humiliation. Alara's hands were folded in her lap, her knuckles white. She'd worn her best dress, plain gray wool with a high collar that partially obscured her scars, and pulled her hair back severe and tight. She looked like a woman preparing for battle, her face a careful mask. Silas wanted to reach for her hand, to offer comfort, but he didn't know if the gesture would be welcome. So he sat still, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and hoped she could feel his presence as support rather than pressure. Judge Fenton entered through a side door, his black robes making him look like a crow. He was older than Silas remembered from the confrontation at the ranch, his face deeply lined, his eyes sharp and assessing. He settled behind the bench with the air of a man who'd seen every variation of human foolishness and believed none of it. "This court is now in session," he announced, his voice dry as old leather. "We're here to address the petition filed by Mr. Clayton Reese challenging the validity of the marriage between Silas Kane and Alara Voss Kane. Mr. Ashford, you may present your case." Thomas Ashford rose, smoothing his vest with practiced gestures. "Your Honor, the facts are straightforward. Mr. Kane faced a deadline imposed by his father's will, marry within 1 year of his wife's death or forfeit his property. With mere weeks remaining, he suddenly married his housekeeper, a woman with whom he'd had no prior romantic involvement. This marriage is clearly a legal maneuver designed to circumvent the will's intent, and therefore should be declared fraudulent and annulled." Fenton made a note. "And your evidence?" "We have testimony from multiple witnesses attesting to the purely transactional nature of this union. Mrs. Henrietta Pritchard will testify that Mr. Kane showed no affection toward Miss Voss prior to the marriage. Mr. Samuel Halford will confirm that the couple displayed no signs of courtship. And Mr. Garrett Moss will attest to Mr. Kane's own admission of desperation." Each name landed like a stone. Silas felt Alara stiffen beside him. Brennan stood, her voice crisp. "Your Honor, the petitioner is confusing the origin of a marriage with its legitimacy. Many marriages in the territory begin from practical necessity, land claims, financial security, family obligation. That doesn't make them fraudulent. It makes them honest about the realities of frontier life." Fenton's expression didn't change. "We'll hear the witnesses. Mr. Ashford, call your first." Mrs. Pritchard took the stand with theatrical reluctance, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, as if the whole proceeding pained her. She confirmed that she'd known the Kane family for years, that she'd observed Silas and Alara in town together, and that there had been no indication of romance between them. "The poor woman clearly agreed out of desperation, Mrs." Pritchard said, her voice quavering with false sympathy. "What choice did she have? A scarred housekeeper with no prospects? Mr. Kane offered security, and she took it. One can hardly blame her." Brennan's cross-examination was surgical. "Mrs. Pritchard, how many conversations have you had with Mrs. Kane?" "Well, a number, please." "None, directly. And how many times have you visited the Kane Ranch?" "I don't see how." "Never. So your testimony is based entirely on brief observations in public settings. Is that correct?" Mrs. Pritchard's face flushed. "I know what I saw." "What you saw was 2 people going about their business. Thank you. No further questions." Samuel Halford was next, confirming that Silas had purchased supplies without mentioning any courtship or wedding plans until after the marriage had already occurred. Brennan established that Halford knew nothing of the couple's private life and had never been inside their home. Garrett Moss proved more problematic. Still nursing his grudge from being shoved in the mud, he testified with obvious relish that Silas had been desperate and that the marriage was obviously fake. "And what makes you say it's fake, Mr. Moss?" Ashford prompted. "Just look at her," Moss said, gesturing toward Alara with undisguised contempt. Man like Cain, he could have had his pick if he'd gone looking proper. But he was out of time, so he grabbed what was available. The words hung in the courtroom, ugly and raw. Silas's hands clenched into fists under the table. Beside him, Alara had gone absolutely still, her breathing shallow, her face drained of color. Brennan stood slowly, her voice cold as winter steel. "Mr. Moss, you were present when Mr. Cain physically confronted you for making crude remarks about Mrs. Cain. Is that correct?" Moss shifted uncomfortably. He overreacted. He defended his wife, a wife you just insulted. Does that sound like the behavior of a man in a fake marriage? He was just protecting his investment, or protecting the woman he married. You're not qualified to judge the interior of anyone's marriage, Mr. Moss, particularly when you've been nursing a public grudge since being humiliated in front of witnesses. Ashford objected, but the damage was done. Moss left the stand red-faced and fuming. Fenton called a brief recess. Silas guided Alara outside into the corridor where she leaned against the wall, her breath coming in short gasps. "I can't do this," she whispered. "Yes, you can." "Did you hear what he said? What they all think?" "I heard." Silas positioned himself in front of her, blocking her from the curious stares of passers-by. "And they're wrong. Every one of them. They're not, though." Her voice cracked. "That's exactly what this was. Desperation and convenience. You said it yourself. You needed a wife. I was available." "That's how it started," Silas interrupted firmly. "Not what it became." She looked up at him, her gray eyes swimming with unshed tears. "What did it become, Silas? Can you even say?" The question demanded honesty. Silas took a breath, searching for words that felt true. "It became a partnership, trust. Two people choosing to stand together instead of alone." He paused, then added quietly, "It became something I don't want to lose." Alara stared at him, and something shifted in her expression. Surprise, hope, fear all tangled together. Before she could respond, Brennan appeared in the doorway. "They're ready for us." Back in the courtroom, Ashford rested his case. Now it was Brennan's turn. She called Ben Harker first. The young rancher testified to seeing Silas and Alara working side by side, to witnessing Alara's courage during the fire, to the respect the community had developed for her. "Does Mrs. Cain strike you as someone being coerced or used?" Brennan asked. "No, ma'am. She strikes me as someone who found her place and decided to fight for it." Mrs. Crenshaw followed, her testimony blunt and uncompromising. She described Alara's care for Jeb, her tireless work on the ranch, the quiet strength she brought to the household. "I've known Silas Cain since he was a boy," Mrs. Crenshaw said. "He's a good man, and he looks at that woman like she matters, not like property, like she's his equal." Ashford's cross-examination tried to establish that these witnesses were biased friends, but Brennan had chosen well. Their sincerity was evident, their observations specific and detailed. Then Brennan called Silas to the stand. He walked to the witness chair on unsteady legs, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. Fenton administered the oath, and Silas swore to tell the truth. Brennan approached with calm confidence. "Mr. Cain, why did you marry Alara Voss?" Silas took a breath. "Because I was going to lose my ranch. My father's will required me to remarry within a year of my wife's death, and I was running out of time." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Ashford smiled. "So it was purely transactional," Brennan pressed. "At first, yes. I needed a legal wife. Alara was the only woman available who might agree." "And why did she agree?" "She didn't. Not at first." Silas found Alara in the crowd, her face pale but composed. "She refused, because she'd been married before to a man who hurt her, and she didn't want to belong to anyone ever again." More murmurs. Fenton raised a hand for silence. "What changed her mind?" Brennan asked. "Jeb, my son. She said she wasn't doing it for me. She was doing it because he deserved to keep his home, and because she was tired of running." "And after the marriage?" How did things change? Silas chose his words carefully. At first they didn't. We lived separate lives under the same roof, but then Reese started threatening us, and we had to work together. And I started seeing who she really was. Not just my housekeeper, but someone strong and capable and brave. Someone who saved a drowning calf in freezing water. Someone who led the fight against a fire that could have destroyed everything. Someone who chose to stay when she could have run. His voice grew stronger, more certain. I married Alora because I was desperate. But I'd marry her again today because she's the best partner I've ever had. Because she makes our home better. Because my son calls her Ma and trusts her completely. And because I can't imagine facing what's ahead without her beside me. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Ashford stood for cross-examination, his expression skeptical. Very touching, Mr. Kane, but when exactly did this transformation occur? When did a business arrangement become a great love story? I didn't say it was a love story, Silas said evenly. I said it was a partnership. Real marriages are built on a lot of things. Respect, trust, shared purpose. Love can grow from that. Or maybe it can't. But either way, what we have is real. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? Discovering all these noble feelings just in time for a legal challenge? I'm discovering them because they're true, and because someone's trying to take away everything we've built. Ashford pressed for another 10 minutes, trying to catch Silas in contradictions, but there were none. The truth was too simple. Two desperate people had made a bargain and found something unexpected in the aftermath. Finally, Ashford sat down and Brennan said, Your Honor, I'd like to call Alora Kane to the stand. Alora's face went white. They'd discussed this possibility, but she'd hoped it wouldn't come to it. Now she had no choice. She walked to the stand with her head high, her scarred hand gripping the rail as she swore the oath. Her voice was barely audible. Brennan approached gently. Mrs. Kane, tell us about your first marriage. Alora's jaw tightened. I was 16. My father sold me to a blacksmith in Kansas. Called it a marriage, but I had no choice. What was that marriage like? Violent. The word came out flat, emotionless. He believed women were property. When I tried to leave, he held my hand over his forge until the skin burned away, said I needed to learn my place. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Even Fenton looked disturbed. How did you escape? Brennan asked quietly. I waited until he was drunk, took what I could carry and ran, walked for weeks, ended up in Deadwood Creek with nothing. And when Silas Kane asked you to marry him, what did you think? Alora's eyes found Silas's across the room. I thought he wanted to own me, use me. Even if he didn't mean it cruelly, I'd still be trapped again. But you said yes. Eventually, on my terms, separate rooms, separate lives, a legal arrangement, nothing more. And has Mr. Kane honored those terms? Every day. Alora's voice strengthened. He's never pushed, never demanded. He treats me like a person, not property. Has your arrangement changed at all since the wedding? Alora hesitated, and Silas could see her wrestling with what to say, how much to reveal. Yes, she said finally, because he showed me I could trust him. He defended me when people mocked me. He valued my work. He listened when I spoke. And when the ranch was threatened, he didn't try to protect me. He fought beside me like an equal. Do you consider yourself truly married to Silas Kane? The question hung in the air. Alora's scarred hand trembled on the rail. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady. Yes, because marriage isn't just words on paper. It's choosing to show up every day. It's working together towards something bigger than yourself. It's trust earned in 100 small moments. Silas and I didn't start with love. We started with necessity. But we built something real from that. Something worth fighting for. Brennan nodded, satisfied. No further questions. Ashford rose for cross-examination, but his confidence had visibly shaken. Mrs. Kane, you've painted a very sympathetic picture, but the fact remains, you entered this marriage for practical reasons, not emotional ones, correct? Yes. And if Mr. Kane lost the ranch, you'd lose your security. I'd lose my home, Alora corrected. There's a difference. Is there? Seems to me you're just as invested in this legal fiction as he is. Alora's eyes hardened. I survived a man who tried to break me. I survived poverty, violence, years of hiding. I don't need Silas Kane's ranch to survive. I'm here because I choose to be. Because for the first time in my life, someone gave me the freedom to choose, and I chose to stay. The words resonated through the courtroom like a bell. Ashford had no response. He returned to his seat, and Alara stepped down, her legs unsteady but her spine straight. Brennan called one final witness, Jeb Kane. The boy climbed into the witness chair, his feet barely touching the floor. He looked terrified but determined, his dark eyes finding his father's face. Brennan kept her questions simple. Jeb, do you like having Alara in your home? Yes, ma'am. Why? Because she takes care of us. She helps with my letters and makes good stew and doesn't get mad when I track mud inside. He paused. And because she makes Pa smile again. Your mother passed away last year. Has Alara tried to replace her? No, ma'am. Ma Alara says Mama's still in my heart, and nobody can take that away. Do you think your father and Alara care about each other? Jeb frowned, thinking hard. I think Pa was sad for a long time, and Ma Alara was scared. But now they're not so sad and scared anymore, because they have each other. Out of the mouths of children, Silas thought, his throat tight. Ashford declined to cross-examine. What could he possibly say to challenge a 7-year-old's simple truth? Brennan rested her case. Fenton called for closing arguments. Ashford went first, reiterating that the marriage had been born from desperation and manipulation of legal requirements. But his words felt hollow now, undermined by the testimony that had preceded them. Brennan's closing was brief and powerful. Your Honor, the petitioner wants you to believe that marriages must begin with romance to be valid. But that's not the law, and it's not reality. People marry for survival, for family, for land, for 100 practical reasons. What matters is not how a marriage begins, but what the parties make of it. Silas and Alara Kane have built a genuine partnership based on mutual respect, shared labor, and earned trust. They faced threats together, worked side by side, and created a home for a child who needed stability. That is a real marriage under any reasonable definition. The petition should be denied. Fenton leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I'll take this under advisement. Decision will be rendered within the week. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell. Silas and Alara stood in the sudden chaos of a dispersing courtroom, neither quite sure what to do. They'd laid themselves bare, exposed every vulnerable truth, and now all they could do was wait. Outside, the afternoon sun was harsh after the dimness of the courtroom. People clustered in small groups discussing what they'd heard. Some looked at Alara with new understanding. Others still whispered behind raised hands. Mrs. Crenshaw pushed through the crowd, pulling Alara into a brief, fierce embrace. You did good, girl. Real good. Ben Harker clapped Silas on the shoulder. Hell of a fight. But Clayton Reese stood apart, his face a mask of cold fury. He locked eyes with Silas across the courthouse steps, and the message was clear. This wasn't over. The ride back to Deadwood Creek was quiet. Jeb dozed in the back of the wagon, exhausted from the tension. Alara sat beside Silas, staring at the passing landscape with unfocused eyes. You all right? Silas asked quietly. I don't know. She pulled her shawl tighter. I've never told anyone about my first husband, about the forge. You were brave to do it. Was I? Or was I just desperate again? Both, maybe, but that doesn't make it less brave. She looked at him, her expression raw. What you said in there, about marrying me again, did you mean it? Silas kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the reins. Every word. Why? Because it's true. He glanced at her. You want me to say I love you? I can't. Not yet. I don't know if what I feel is love or just recognition. Like finding someone who understands what it means to keep going when everything's broken. But I know I don't want to do this alone anymore. And I know that you make everything, the ranch, Jeb, my life, better just by being in it. Alara's breath hitched. That's the most honest thing anyone's ever said to me. Then believe it. She turned away, but not before he saw tears tracking down her scarred cheek. They arrived home after dark. Jeb stumbled inside and fell asleep almost immediately. Silas and Alara moved through the evening routine in companionable silence, banking the fire, checking the animals, securing the doors. When everything was done, They stood in the kitchen, the space between them charged with everything unsaid. "Whatever Fenton decides," Alara said quietly, "I want you to know I don't regret this. Any of it." "Neither do I." She took a step toward him, then stopped, uncertainty crossing her face. Silas closed the distance instead, slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wanted. She didn't. He raised his hand, gently touching her scarred cheek. She flinched but didn't pull away. "You're beautiful," he said softly. "Don't lie. I'm not." His thumb traced the line of scar tissue. "You're the strongest person I've ever met. You survived things that would have broken most people. You built yourself back from nothing. That's beautiful, Alara. All of it." Her eyes filled with tears, and this time she didn't try to hide them. She leaned into his touch, just slightly, and Silas felt something in his chest crack open, something that had been locked away since Margaret died. Not quite love. Not yet. But the beginning of it. The possibility. "Silas?" she whispered. "Yeah? I'm scared." "Me too. What if we lose? Then we figure out what comes next, together." That word again. It had become a promise between them, something more binding than the marriage certificate filed in Greystone. Alara pulled back slightly, composing herself. "I should sleep." "Alara, oh, please, I need time to think." He nodded, letting her go. She disappeared into her room, and Silas stood alone in the kitchen, feeling the weight of the day settle over him like a blanket. They'd told their truth. They'd fought for their right to stay. Now all they could do was wait and hope that truth was enough. The week passed in agonizing slowness. They worked the ranch, cared for Jeb, went through the motions of daily life, but the uncertainty hung over everything, a shadow that wouldn't lift. On the 6th day, a rider came from Billings. Silas saw him approaching and felt his heart kick against his ribs. Alara emerged from the barn, her face pale, and together they waited as the messenger dismounted. "Mr. Kane? Mrs. Kane?" The young man held out an envelope, official and sealed. "From Judge Fenton." Silas took it with numb fingers. The messenger tipped his hat and rode away, leaving them alone in the yard. "Open it," Alara said, her voice barely audible. Silas broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper. His eyes scanned the legal language once, twice, making sure he understood. Then he looked at Alara, and despite everything, he smiled. "We won." Her knees buckled. Silas caught her, holding her upright as she gasped for breath. "Fenton ruled that the marriage is legitimate. The petition is denied. The land stays ours." Alara looked up at him, disbelief and hope warring on her face. "We won? We won!" She laughed, a sound Silas had never heard from her before, bright and startled and free. And then she was hugging him, her arms tight around his waist, her face pressed against his chest. Silas held her close, feeling her shake with relief and exhaustion, and something that might have been joy. They'd fought for their right to exist as they were, imperfect, unconventional, but real. And they'd won. But as he held Alara in the afternoon sunlight, Silas knew the real fight was just beginning, not for the land, for what came next, for figuring out how to turn a partnership born from desperation into something that could last, for learning how to be more than survivors, for becoming a family, not just in name, but in truth. The celebration that night was modest, a good meal, Jeb's laughter echoing through the house, and a quiet relief that settled into their bones like warmth after a long winter. But beneath the surface, Silas could feel the shift. They'd won the legal battle, secured the land, proven their marriage legitimate in the eyes of the law. Now came the harder part, proving it to themselves. Alara had retreated into herself after the initial rush of victory, moving through the evening with careful efficiency, keeping that invisible wall firmly in place. Silas recognized the pattern. Every time they got close to something real, something vulnerable, she pulled back. And he couldn't blame her. Trust wasn't built in a day, especially not for someone who'd had it shattered so completely. That night, after Jeb had gone to sleep, Silas found Alara outside again, standing near the pasture fence where she'd stood so many times before. The April air was still cold, but there was a promise of warmth in it now, a hint that winter might finally be loosening its grip. "Can't sleep?" he asked, joining her. "Too much in my head." "Want to talk about it?" She was quiet for a long moment, her breath fogging in the moonlight. "I keep waiting for it to feel real, the victory, but it just feels temporary." "Why temporary?" "Because good things don't last. Not for people like me." Silas leaned against the fence beside her. "What if that's not true anymore?" "How can it not be true? It's all I've ever known." "Then maybe it's time to learn something different." He turned to face her. "I'm not saying it'll be easy, but you don't have to keep expecting disaster. We won, Alara. The land is ours. Nobody can take it away." Reese isn't going to just accept that. She was right, of course. Men like Clayton Reese didn't take defeat gracefully, but that was a problem for tomorrow. "Let him try," Silas said. "We've got witnesses now, the law on our side, and a whole community that fought a fire with us. He's just one man with money. We're more than that." Alara looked at him, something shifting in her expression. "When did you become an optimist?" "When I realized I had something worth fighting for." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning. Alara's breath caught, and for a moment Silas thought she might say something, might finally let down the last of her walls. But instead she turned back to the pasture, her scarred hand gripping the fence rail. "I don't know how to do this," she said quietly. "Do what?" "Be someone's wife. Build a life with someone. Trust that it won't all fall apart." Silas moved closer, close enough that she could feel his presence, but not so close that she'd feel trapped. "Then we learn together, because I don't know how to do it either, not anymore. Margaret and I, we grew up together. We knew each other our whole lives. This is different." "Different how?" "We're choosing it. Every day. Not because we have to, but because we want to." Alara finally looked at him, and in the moonlight her eyes were luminous with unshed tears. "I don't know if I know how to want things, Silas. For so long, I just survived. Wanting felt dangerous. Then start small." He reached out slowly, giving her time to refuse, and took her scarred hand in his. "Want tomorrow. Want to see the garden planted. Want to teach Jeb his letters. Want to wake up in a home that's yours." Her fingers tightened around his. "And you? Do I want you?" The question was raw, vulnerable, and it took Silas's breath away. "Only if you do," he said quietly. "I won't push you, Alara. I meant what I said at the trial. I'd marry you again because of who you are, what we've built. But if all we ever have is partnership and respect, that's enough. It's more than most people get." "But what if I want more?" The words came out barely above a whisper. "What if I'm just too scared to reach for it?" Silas raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her scarred knuckles. "Then we take it slow. As slow as you need. I'm not going anywhere." A single tear tracked down her cheek, catching the moonlight. "You promise?" "I promise." She leaned into him then, resting her head against his shoulder, and they stood together in the cold Montana night, two people learning how to hope again. Spring arrived in earnest over the next few weeks, transforming the landscape from brown and gray to vivid green. The burned pasture began to recover, new grass pushing through the ash like resurrection. Silas worked from dawn to dusk, repairing winter damage, preparing fields for planting, tending to the growing herd. And Alara worked beside him, her strength and skill no longer surprising, but simply part of the rhythm of their days. The town's attitude toward them shifted too. People who'd whispered and judged now nodded in greeting. Mrs. Pritchard even stopped Alara in the general store one day to comment on the weather, a gesture that felt like reluctant acceptance. The fire had changed things. Seeing Alara lead that fight, seeing her courage and capability, had forced Deadwood Creek to reconsider its assumptions. But the real change happened in smaller, quieter moments. One afternoon, Silas came in from the fields to find Alara and Jeb working together at the table, her scarred hand guiding his as he practiced his letters. The boy's tongue stuck out in concentration, and Alara's face held a softness Silas had never seen before. "That's good," she said gently. "Now, try your name." Jeb carefully formed the letters, Jebkane, then looked up at her expectantly. "Perfect," Alara said, and the pride in her voice was unmistakable. "Can I write your name too?" She hesitated, then nodded. "All right." Jeb bent over the slate again, his small hand moving deliberately. When he finished, he held it up. Alarkane. "See? You're a Kane too," he announced with satisfaction. Alara's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled through them. "I suppose I am." Silas felt something in his chest expand, warm and full. This was what family looked like. Not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but small moments of acceptance and belonging. That evening, after Jeb was in bed, Alara lingered by the fire instead of retreating to her room. Silas joined her and they sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wood crackle and pop. "I've been thinking," Alara said finally, "about what you said, taking things slow." Silas's heart kicked up a notch, but he kept his voice steady. "Yeah? I think I'm ready for more. Not all at once, but more. What does more look like?" She turned to face him, her expression open in a way he'd never seen before. "I don't know exactly. Maybe sitting together like this more often. Maybe not sleeping in separate rooms forever. Maybe learning how to be close to someone without being afraid." Silas reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "We can do that, whatever pace feels right. You're very patient." "I've got time. We both do." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat together until the fire burned low, neither one wanting to break the fragile peace of the moment. But peace, as always, proved temporary. The trouble came on a Thursday morning in early May. Silas was in the barn when he heard hoofbeats approaching fast. He grabbed his rifle, a reflex now, and stepped outside to see Ben Harker riding up, his face grim. "Kane, you need to hear this." "What happened?" "Reese left town. Pulled out yesterday with all his men. Word is he's headed back east." Silas frowned. "That doesn't sound like him. Just giving up?" "That's what I thought. So I asked around." Harker dismounted, lowering his voice. "Turns out there's a warrant out for him. Federal marshals have been looking into his land dealings, fraud, intimidation, arson. Someone testified against him." "Who?" "Don't know for sure, but the timing's suspicious. Right after your trial, suddenly the law's interested in Reese. Somebody with authority must have decided he'd gone too far." Silas felt a weight lift from his shoulders. If Reese was running from federal charges, he wouldn't be coming back to Deadwood Creek. The threat was over. "You sure about this?" Silas asked. "Sure as I can be. Sheriff confirmed the warrant. Reese is gone, Kane, for good." After Harker left, Silas found Alara in the garden plot behind the house, turning soil with a spade. She looked up as he approached, reading his expression. "What is it?" "Reese is gone. Federal warrant for fraud and arson. He fled the territory." The spade fell from her hands. "Gone?" "Gone." She stood there, dirt on her hands, disbelief written across her face. Then slowly, a smile spread, tentative at first, then growing into something bright and genuine. "It's really over," she breathed. "It's really over." She laughed, the sound ringing clear across the yard, and launched herself at him. Silas caught her, spinning her around as she clung to him, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, she was still smiling, her face alight with something he'd never seen before, pure, uncomplicated joy. "We did it," she said. "We actually did it." "Yeah, we did." She kissed him then, quick and impulsive, barely more than a brush of lips. But it was the first time she'd initiated any affection, and it sent electricity through Silas's entire body. She pulled back, suddenly shy. "Sorry, Don't apologize." He cupped her scarred cheek gently. "Do it again if you want." This time the kiss was slower, deeper, full of tentative exploration. Alara's hands clutched his shirt, and Silas felt years of careful distance dissolving between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alara rested her forehead against his chest. "I'm terrified," she whispered. "Of what?" "That I'm going to wake up and this will all have been a dream. That I'll be back in Kansas or running again or—" "You're here," Silas interrupted firmly. "You're home, and I'm not letting you go." She looked up at him, searching his face. You mean that? Every word. That night marked a turning point. Alara didn't retreat to her separate room. Instead, she stayed up talking with Silas until the early hours, sharing stories from her past she'd never told anyone. Not just the pain, but the small joys too. A kindness from a stranger on the road. A sunset over the plains that had made her believe beauty still existed. The first time she'd tasted fresh bread after weeks of hunger. And Silas shared his own stories. About Margaret, about his parents, about the dreams he'd had for this ranch that had seemed impossible after his wife's death. I thought I'd lost everything, he admitted. The land was just land. I couldn't see a future anymore. And now? Now I see one. With you. With Jeb. Building something that lasts. Alara's hand found his in the darkness. I want that too. I'm just learning how. Then we'll learn together. As spring progressed into summer, the ranch flourished. The burned pasture healed completely, the garden produced vegetables in abundance, and the herd grew strong and healthy. Word spread through the territory about the couple who'd fought fire and won against a corrupt land speculator, and people started seeking Silas out for advice, for partnership, for community. But the most profound changes happened within the walls of their home. Alara moved her belongings into Silas's room, one piece at a time, slowly, carefully, giving herself permission to claim space. The first night she slept in his bed, she lay rigid with tension, expecting some demand or violation. But Silas simply held her, patient and gentle, until she finally relaxed into sleep. Thank you, she whispered in the darkness. For what? For not pushing, for letting me come to you. Always. Their physical intimacy grew gradually, each step taken only when Alara felt ready. There were setbacks, moments when old fears surfaced and she needed space. But Silas never pressured, never complained. He understood that healing wasn't linear, that trust had to be rebuilt one small choice at a time. And slowly, Alara began to believe she deserved this. Deserved kindness, pleasure, partnership. Deserved to be wanted for who she was, scars and all. One morning in late June, she woke before dawn to find Silas already up, standing at the window watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. She joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. Couldn't sleep? She asked. Didn't want to miss this. They stood together as light flooded the valley, illuminating everything they'd fought for. Silas? Yeah? I love you. The words were quiet, almost shy, but they hit Silas with the force of a lightning strike. He turned to face her, seeing the vulnerability and certainty mingled in her eyes. Say that again, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I love you. Stronger this time, more sure. I didn't think I could love anyone again, but I do. I love you. Silas pulled her close, pressing his forehead to hers. I love you too. Have for a while now. Just didn't know if you were ready to hear it. I'm ready. She pulled back to look at him fully. I'm ready for all of it. They made love as the sun rose, slow and tender and full of promises spoken and unspoken. And when it was over, Alara didn't pull away or retreat. She stayed curled against Silas's side, her scarred hand resting over his heart. Thank you, she said. For what? For seeing me. Not just the scars or the damage, but me. Silas kissed her temple. Always. The final piece of their transformation came in August, when Deadwood Creek held its annual summer gathering. In the past, Silas had attended alone or not at all. This year, he arrived with Alara on one arm and Jeb running ahead, excited to play with other children. The gathering was held in the field behind the schoolhouse, tables laden with food, children playing tag, adults clustered in conversation. As Silas and Alara approached, conversations paused. People turned to look. For a moment, Alara tensed, ready to face judgment. But instead, Mrs. Crenshaw stepped forward with a warm smile. Alara, come help us with this high table. We need someone with sense to organize it. Mrs. Pritchard, of all people, nodded in agreement. Yes, please, before the men get into it and ruin everything. Other women chimed in, welcoming Alara into their circle with the casual acceptance of equals. She looked back at Silas, surprised and uncertain. He nodded encouragingly. Go on, I'll find you later. She took a breath and walked toward the women, her spine straight and her head high. And as she joined them, chatting about pies and preserves and the coming harvest, something inside her finally settled. She belonged here, not as the scarred housekeeper or the desperate bride, but as Alara Kane, a woman who'd survived hell and built herself a home on the other side. Later, as the sun began to set and music started up, Silas found her sitting with a group of women, laughing at something Mrs. Crenshaw had said. The sound of her laughter still caught him off guard, bright and unguarded and free. He approached, holding out his hand. "Dance with me?" Alara's eyes widened. "I don't know how." "Neither do I. We'll figure it out." She took his hand and let him lead her to where other couples were swaying to fiddle music. They moved awkwardly at first, finding their rhythm, but gradually settled into something that felt right. "People are watching," Alara murmured. "Let them." "Doesn't it bother you?" "Why would it? They're watching a man dance with his wife. Nothing scandalous about that." She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Your wife still sounds strange." "Good strange or bad strange?" "Good. Definitely good." As they turned slowly under the Montana sky, surrounded by community and music and the laughter of children, Silas felt a completeness he'd thought lost forever. This wasn't the life he'd imagined when he desperately asked his housekeeper to marry him. It was better, because it was built on choice, on respect, on two broken people deciding they were stronger together than apart. When the dance ended, Jeb ran up, grabbing both their hands. "Come on! They're starting the bonfire!" He dragged them toward where a massive pile of wood was being lit, flames leaping into the twilight. People gathered around, faces glowing in the firelight, and someone started a song. Alara stood between Silas and Jeb, holding both their hands, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly seen, not as damaged goods or a tragic figure or someone to be pitied, but as a woman who'd survived, who'd fought, who'd chosen her own destiny. The scars on her face and hand would never fade, but they were part of her story now, not the whole story, but the chapters that had led her here, to this moment, to this family, to this home. As the bonfire roared and people sang, Silas leaned close to her ear. "You all right?" She turned to him, her eyes bright with tears and firelight, and something that looked like joy. "I'm more than all right," she said. "I'm home." And she was. The months that followed were not without challenges. There were hard days when old fears resurfaced, when Alara would wake from nightmares of her first husband and need reassurance that she was safe. There were moments when Silas struggled with grief, missing Margaret but feeling guilty for moving forward. There were adjustments and arguments and learning curves, but they faced everything together. By the time autumn arrived, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, the ranch had become more than just a piece of land. It was a sanctuary, for Silas, for Alara, for Jeb, and increasingly for others who needed a place to belong. They took in a pregnant woman fleeing an abusive situation, giving her shelter until she could get on her feet. They hired a young man with a troubled past, teaching him ranching and giving him a chance to prove himself. Word spread that the Kane Ranch was a place of second chances, and people came seeking hope. Alara blossomed in this role, her natural strength and empathy making her a fierce advocate for the broken and desperate. She understood them in ways Silas never could, and she used that understanding to help them find their way back to wholeness. One evening in October, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Alara said, "I never thought my pain would be useful for anything." "What do you mean?" "Everything I survived. The abuse, the running, the years of hiding. I thought it was just damage, something to be ashamed of, but now I see it differently." "How?" "It taught me how to recognize people who are hurting, how to help them without judgment, how to offer the kind of grace I needed and didn't get." She paused. "It made me who I am, and I don't hate who I am anymore." Silas took her hand, squeezing gently. "Good, because I love who you are." She smiled, that bright smile that still had the power to steal his breath. "I know, and I'm finally starting to believe I deserve it." Winter came again, but this time the cold held no terror. The ranch was prepared, the cupboards stocked, the house warm and secure. And when the first snow fell, covering the land in white, Alara stood at the window with Jeb, pointing out animal tracks and teaching him their names. "That's a rabbit," she said. "And there, see the bigger prints? That's a deer." "What about those?" Jeb pointed to a line of paw prints. "Wolf, maybe. Or a big dog." "Are we safe from wolves, Ma Alara?" The question was innocent, but it held echoes of bigger fears. Alara knelt beside him, meeting his eyes. "We're safe, sweetheart. We've got strong walls, and your pa is a good shot. And we look out for each other. That's how we stay safe. Together." Jeb nodded, satisfied, and ran off to play with his wooden horses. Silas, who'd been watching from across the room, felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was his family. Not the one he'd been born into or the one he'd lost, but the one he'd chosen and built from desperation and hope. On Christmas Eve, they celebrated quietly. Just the three of them and Mrs. Crenshaw, who'd become something like a grandmother to Jeb. They shared a meal, exchanged small gifts, and told stories by the fire. When Jeb had fallen asleep and Mrs. Crenshaw had retired to the guest room, Silas and Alara sat together in the firelight. "I have something for you," Silas said, pulling a small wooden box from his pocket. Alara opened it carefully. Inside was a ring, simple gold, engraved with a pattern of intertwined vines. "I know we're already married," Silas said, "but I wanted you to have something that wasn't about legal requirements or desperation, something that was about choice." Alara's eyes filled with tears as she lifted the ring from the box. "It's beautiful." "It's a promise," Silas said, taking her scarred hand, "that I choose you every day, not because I have to, but because I want to, because you're the best thing that ever happened to me, even if it started from the worst circumstances." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and Alara stared at it, tears streaming down her face. "I choose you too," she whispered. "Every day, for the rest of my life." They kissed as snow fell outside, sealing a promise that had nothing to do with land or inheritance and everything to do with love earned through fire and testing. Spring returned as it always did, bringing renewal and growth. On a warm April morning, exactly 1 year after their legal victory, Alara stood in the garden with her hands in the soil, planting seeds for the coming season. She'd changed so much from the frightened, scarred woman who'd agreed to a marriage of convenience. The scars were still there. They always would be. But now she wore them differently. Not as shame, but as evidence. Proof that she'd survived, that she'd fought, that she'd refused to be broken. Jeb ran past, chasing a butterfly, his laughter echoing across the yard. In the barn, Silas was working with the young man they'd hired, teaching him how to mend harness. From the house came the smell of bread baking, a skill Alara had perfected over the winter. This was her life now. Not a dream or a temporary reprieve, but reality. Solid and real, and hers to keep. "Ma Alara," Jeb called. "Come see. The calf you saved, she's got a baby." Alara wiped her hands on her apron and followed Jeb to the barn, where sure enough, the calf she'd pulled from the creek, now a young cow, had given birth to a wobbly-legged baby. "She's perfect," Alara breathed, watching the newborn struggle to its feet. Silas joined them, wrapping an arm around Alara's shoulders. "Life keeps going, doesn't it?" "Yeah, it does." They stood together, watching new life take its first uncertain steps, and Alara thought about how far they'd all come. From that desperate proposal in a Montana winter to this moment of simple peace and plenty. They'd saved each other, she realized, not from danger or poverty or legal threats, though they'd done that too, but from loneliness, from the belief that they had to face the world alone. That evening, as the sun set over the mountains, Alara stood on the porch with Silas and Jeb, looking out at the land they'd fought so hard to keep. "Do you ever regret it?" Silas asked quietly. Saying yes that night. Alara thought about the question, really considered it. She thought about the fear, the uncertainty, the moments when she'd been sure she'd made a terrible mistake. Then she thought about everything that had come after, the partnership, the trust, the love, the home she'd built from nothing. "No," she said firmly. "Not for a second." "Good." Silas pulled her close. "Because I was terrified you'd say yes." She laughed, surprised. "You were?" "Terrified. I thought, what if she's miserable? What if I can't give her what she needs? What if I ruin everything?" And now? Now I know we figured it out. Together. That word again, the one that had become their foundation. Jeb tugged at Alara's skirt. Tell me the story again, about how you and Pa got married. Alara glanced at Silas, who nodded encouragingly. All right, she said, settling into the porch chair with Jeb on her lap. It was winter, and the snow was so deep you could barely see the fences. Your pa came to me one night and asked me a question that changed everything. What did he ask? He asked if I'd marry him. Not because he loved me, we barely knew each other, but because he was going to lose the ranch, and I was the only one who might say yes. And you said yes? Not at first. I was scared. I'd been hurt before, and I didn't trust anyone. She stroked Jeb's hair gently. But then I thought about you, about how you needed a home, and I thought maybe I was tired of being scared. So you said yes? So I said yes, and we got married in Greystone on a cold winter morning, and we were both terrified because we didn't know if it would work. But it did work, Jeb said confidently. It did, not right away. We had to learn how to trust each other, how to work together, how to be a family, and there were people who tried to take it all away from us. But you fought them. We did, together, and we won. Not just the ranch, but something better. We found each other, really found each other, and we built this life piece by piece until it became home. Jeb yawned, satisfied with the story. I'm glad you said yes, Ma Alara. Me too, sweetheart, me too. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Alara felt Silas's hand find hers, their fingers interlacing with the easy familiarity of long practice. They'd started with nothing but desperation and a legal contract. They'd survived threats, fire, judgment, and their own fears. And from all that struggle, they'd built something that mattered. Not just a marriage, but a home. Not just survival, but a life worth living. And as night fell over Deadwood Creek, Alara Kane, once scarred and broken, once convinced she'd never deserve happiness, sat surrounded by her family, and finally, completely, believed she was exactly where she belonged. The ranch would continue. The seasons would turn. There would be hard times and good times, challenges and triumphs. But whatever came, they would face it together. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.